Good evening. How are y'all doing this evening? What this Combine thing is? Okay. Glad to hear you're interested. Yeah, haven't done a presentation in a while, so I'm looking forward to doing one. Especially something that's a little more original, not just doing like a book report like I was in grade school. You assume it's a dragon assembled from mechs like Go Lion. You know, it would be funny if BattleTech actually had combining robots, but unfortunately I don't think they do. But you never know. Yeah, like I feel like I've been playing Ghost of Tsushima for so long that you know, I'm not even used to this screen anymore. But yeah, this evening we're going to start with an occasional series on BattleTech that I call Combine Studies, because I am a giant nerd and I am comparing what I'm doing here to, you know, Japanese studies, East Asian studies, that sort of thing. And part of it's, you know, because it's like multidisciplinary and things like that, but, you know, I will leave more of the details to the presentation. So I don't know how frequently I'm going to do this. I kind of want to do like more than once a year or whatever, but, you know, like, let me see if I can get a good clip on it. I don't really want to just do this exclusively and like abandon other things. Like, I want to diversify with it and kind of show how you can apply like a knowledge, or like, you know, how you can think about Japanese history and Japanese studies, culture, and apply it to all sorts of different things. And I think like this one works well because I, you know, happen to know it. So, well, you know, without further ado, let me see if I can get this presentation started. Assume some folks may want to come in pretty soon too, but we will see. Hello. How's it going? Good to see you here. Okay, let's go and switch this up. There we go. Can folks see the screen? Good, good. Okay, so this is my introduction to Combine Studies. So what are we covering today? So we are going to just start from the very basics, because, you know, we don't know, like, do people really know what BattleTech is? I know a few of you do, but, you know, some folks may not. So we're going to talk about what's BattleTech. We're going to talk about what is Combine Studies. And following that, we're just going to kind of go through a very brief history of what the Draconis Combine is. Oh, thank you for the gift sub. Oh, thank you for the sub. And, you know, after the history, talk about, well, why bother doing this? And then after that, we're going to ask the question, am I even qualified to do this? Why listen to me? And after you're sort of convinced that I'm okay for the job, I'm going to tell you why I can only do so much. And then after that, we're going to have a bonus. So without further ado, let's start. And of course, we are going to start any kind of like fan-related thing with a disclaimer that the opinions and views expressed here are my own. I am not affiliated with Catalyst Game Labs, nor any other entity involved with the production and creation of BattleTech products. BattleTech, Mech, BattleMech, and MechWarrior are registered trademarks and/or trademarks of the TOPS company incorporated in the United States and other countries. Also Microsoft for MechWarrior, but, you know, trademarks. Gotta love them. But first, what is BattleTech? BattleTech is a mecha-centric wargame. Yes, those legal experts are as fierce as a Jade Falcon banker. They are actually even more fierce. Like, they may not have, like, treasure ships, but they are very omnipresent. But yes, BattleTech is a game of giant stompy robots. It is mecha-centric wargaming, where giant robots called BattleMechs shoot and occasionally punch and kick and push each other to various pieces on the tabletop. In varying levels of detail, because they're, just to nerd out a little bit, there are at least 2 different versions of BattleTech in active use. There's the classic tabletop version, which kind of very much has its 80s rule set of hitting specific locations and excruciating detail. And then there's Alpha Strike, which is kind of closer to like Warhammer Kill Team. It's a skirmish game. A lot less detail, but it lets you put more units on the board. But not only that, BattleTech is a franchise. It is a 40-year-old franchise created in 1984 by FASA Corporation. Tabletop products currently by Catalyst Game Labs. And because of weird shenanigans at the end of the 90s by FASA Corporation, the IP is basically split between TOPS and Microsoft. So this franchise is basically tabletop and video games, novels. There was even a cartoon back in the 90s. Played at the thrilling pace of 2 hours for like 5 minutes of in-game time. Yes. A round is about 10 seconds in classic BattleTech in supposedly what real time should be. And a turn can take a half hour. Well, you know, gotta do something on your Sunday afternoons. You're not, and you know, you didn't have the internet to kill yourself with. Should note that the cartoon is actually viewable in full on YouTube these days. I do not have a link, but it should be easy to find. Also, one note: Bachal means battle challenge, and it is not important. Just in case you were wondering what that meme was. So what else do we have with a 40-year-old franchise? We've got a complex setting and lore. This is an immersive space opera. There are very few retcons that were actually done for the series. You know, you'd think for something that's 40 years old, they would have rebooted it a couple of times, changed some things around, but that is actually not the case. BattleTech has surprisingly few changes for something that old. So, you know, I've got a whole bunch of like icons and a guy here and a map here, and there's just loads and loads of characters and places and units and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I am not going to go and itemize each one on this. You can go onto sarna.net, which is the BattleTech wiki, and find out yourself. So what else does this franchise have? Well, this franchise has a bunch of stereotypes because BattleTech is, as mentioned, from the 80s, and it shows. It got better over time, though. You know, the scene here is the Draconis Combine throne room, and you can really just hear Prosity's sketch in this. But enough about that. I think it's time to move on. So, what is Combine Studies? Combine Studies is a multifaceted examination of the Draconis Combine, a fictional polity in the science fiction setting known as BattleTech. This is basically area studies for a game. So, area studies, for those who don't know, was basically kind of a subject, an interdisciplinary subject that was kind of created post-war in the United States, where different areas were subjected to multidisciplinary study. So, like, not just historians, but also literature, language, anthropology, sociology, etc. They would all kind of get together and just discuss a particular area. So Japan studies was one, China was another, and the US government funded a bunch of that stuff. And to this day, you will have like majors and departments in various universities that have area studies. So Okay, so what does that entail for us as Combine studies? Well, we've got a few areas of investigation. So we can talk about, for example, the in real life context of the game itself. It's the 80s. You've got a giant robot game based on some Japanese toys. You got to fill it with factions. And because it's the 80s, samurai and ninja were really popular at the time. So, like, why don't we look at the context of the 80s and see how that informs what the BattleTech is, what the Draconis Combine is. Talking about analogs and inspiration. Draconis Combine, which I will go into detail a little later, it's based on Japanese stuff, based on samurai and things like that. So what are the historical, cultural, mythological, etc. elements that are used in developing this faction? And because it was the 80s and, just in general, what are the misapprehensions and myths that kind of get taken as a real thing in this, fictional place? So, fictional history, fictional people, but they're kind of in the far future thinking about what are these Japanese things that we're following? Is what they're following actually real in the sense of is it based and grounded in something that existed in Japanese history? Is it something that was just made up by the authors? Is it something that the authors misunderstood and thought was real and then put it into the story or put it into the franchise? Going on, we can talk about Japaneseness. There's actually a lot of modern discourse about kind of what Japaneseness is and whether or not it is a thing that exists. An analog of it might be what you would call Nihonjinron, which is kind of this idea that Japan is a unique culture and polity that is quintessentially unique and is not something that is easily replicable elsewhere. So, that's kind of cultural spread there, but also we can talk about how House Kurita, which is the ruling family of the Combine, attempted to impose this from the top because they're, spoiler alert, they're kind of an authoritarian government. And so we can kind of see how did they attempt to kind of impose this idea of Japaneseness on their subjects? And so just these two things together, we're kind of getting some interesting things going on, I would get. So on that, let's just do a very brief history of what the Draconis Combine is. This is for folks who know BattleTech kind of already know this history, I assume. But, for those who don't know, in the 23rd century, far from Earth, about 440 light years from Terra, you've got two brothers, Shiro and Urizen Kurita. They create a star nation centered around their family's desire to conquer known space. This was Shiro's idea. Urizen was basically his general. And the dynasty that they would form is basically dedicated to conquering all of the known galaxy. Yeah. So pretty authoritarian starts here. So they're raised by a pretty strict father who's too into quote unquote 17th century samurai culture. And in this, they apply guile, ruthlessness, brutality. They unify their home planet, New Samarkand. Then they kind of use the same tactics to take over other nearby star systems, and eventually, a few hundred years later, they've got a big star empire, which they call the Draconis Combine. So, it's because I think there's a astronomical formation called the Draconis Rift that this polity was based near, and that's why it's the Draconis Combine. But, ultimately, they like dragons, so we get a lot of dragon motifs in the Draconis Combine. So what kind of empire is this? Well, at least at the beginning, this was a multicultural empire. You have two brothers who were of Japanese descent. They had family. They had a family that were really into it. They follow their father's footsteps. And the culture of the Combine, imposed from the top down, was basically a mix of these brothers' totalitarian tendencies, some of the mishmash of Japanese philosophy that they learned from their father and they developed themselves, and then the local cultures of their conquests. So, here illustrated is something from the 80s House Kurita source book, and it is Kurita troops break up a Leif Erikson Day celebration sponsored by the Sons of Canute and the Chrysanthemum Cultural Appreciation Society on Susquehanna. Say that 5 times fast. But yes, this is basically a portion of the Draconis Combine that's known as Rosalhag or Rosalhag, and they're primarily of Scandinavian descent. The Draconis Combine conquers them fairly early on in their history, but they have always kind of fiercely tried to maintain their cultural identity. And regardless, you get kind of this mix of stuff going on here. But, despite that and despite their attempts, like several centuries later, so, the Draconis Combine started in the 24th century. By 27th century, Urizen Kurita II starts imposing a series of reforms in the Combine that would basically place Japanization front and center. This is where, like, the Draconis Combine seriously becomes like the so-called Japanese Star Empire of the setting, which is basically a mishmash of historical and fantastical elements throughout Japanese history and culture, as viewed from basically 1,000 years in the future. So BattleTech proper kind of starts as, it starts basically in 3025, more or less. There's plenty of history before that, but the game traditionally started in 3025, so that's what we're talking about, basically 1,000 years in the future. There isn't as many generations descendant, right? No life extension here. That is correct. Over time, life expectancy in the so-called inner sphere, which is the kind of like the main play setting of BattleTech, like life expectancy increases to the point where maybe 120 is not that uncommon, but Urizen Kurita II is like several generations descendant of the original brothers. So that's right. So yeah, you've got a Star Empire that is basically the Japanese or samurai faction here. There are other like kind of cultures that show up in BattleTech. So for example, you've got the Capellan Confederation, which used to be like a mishmash of Chinese and Russian. The Davians of the Federated Sons, who are like Franco-Anglo, basically. Lyrans who are kind of German. That sort of thing. But I would say that of the set that you have here, it's probably the Combine that's most distinctly like of a particular polity, with the Capellans probably being in second place for that sort of thing. So that being said, okay, why? Why am I even doing this? Why would I even do something like this? Well, yeah, BattleTech strikes a great middle ground between hard sci-fi and stuff you suspend your disbelief on. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's a board game, It's a very rich, detailed setting, but it's designed to service a game. And so you're always going to have a mix, especially BattleTech is about giant fighting robots, and giant robots are not actually that practical. So, you're already suspending your disbelief by assuming that, giant walking robots are the ultimate in battlefield technology. So, yeah, so why do this? Well, I'm a giant weeb. So, I like, anime, manga, Japanese stuff. But recently, about 6 years ago, so I started getting really into Japanese history generally, and specifically the Edo period. So, and I've been doing those streams related to Edo period history earlier over the past few months. And, I figure why not try to combine the two, two great flavors. Pop culture history. I primarily present Edo period history topics. I'm not playing like Ghost of Tsushima ad nauseum. But it's interesting to like take the knowledge I've learned and try to apply it to other places. So like, pop culture and like franchises I enjoy. Like it's interesting to see like how can I take that information and apply it to like the 80s and pop culture in the 80s and how those play together. And yeah, and some detective work. It's like this is an old franchise and trying to figure out like all the different elements of it and figuring out like what is what's a myth, what's dated understanding, or what's just plain wrong, or what is something that an author decided to be creative about and actually produce something unique. So trying to like piece these out is kind of a challenge, and I think it's interesting and worth trying. And yeah, I have like sword attached with magnets. That is possible. Like I am looking at I may as well just digress a little bit and talk about why I have so many questions about this. And just to start off with, so this is like a Draconis Combine general or officer who wields a dice show because certain people of the DCMS or Draconis Combine muster soldiery have the right to carry the dice show, the long and short sword that became like very common in like the Sengoku period into the Edo period. And if you're familiar with these, plus soldiers carrying actual swords in a universe full of giant robots, plasma guns, and flechette rifles is kind of interesting on its own. I mean, the whole carrying swords thing is that's as recent as 1945, so like it's not unheard of for, after all, we're talking about the Draconis Combine, and a non-trivial amount of it, even if they're not explicit about it, is being derived from the IJA, from the Imperial Japanese Army, from the Meiji period onwards into 1945, essentially. But this is where we start getting into questions. Like, those, like, World War II soldiers carried one sword, and they had very specific, it was, like, carried in a specific way with a sword belt and stuff like that. This is, like, basically, I took two Edo period katana, and I somehow attached it to this, like, futuristic dress uniform. It's also on the wrong side. Like, these are supposed to be mounted on the left-hand side, so you draw with your right. And at least when I, maybe it's different in the future, in the far future, but when I was taking kendo, like, everything was right-handed. Like, you did not accommodate left-handers, essentially. So yeah, like, what if you mirror their image? So, and this is the funny thing. This is only halfway. I only covered part of this, but this is only halfway mirrored. My suspicion is that they mirrored the image and then they edited it so that it looked like it was the right way. So, like, the sunburst that you see on the upper left should be on the upper left. You don't see it, but the collar has, like, a Draconis Combine logo on it. That is the correct orientation, but this belt is not in the correct orientation. And then on top of that, like, what they were trying to do here feels like they were trying to mimic what an Edo period samurai would do to hold their swords, but they can't really do it because there's actually fewer straps that you can use. And the other thing is, if you see this long sword here, and you see this wrapping around it, that's actually something that you're supposed to be able to use to tie the sword around your waist. It's not kind of meant to just stay there. So, like, from what I can tell with this, like, the short sword is, like, kind of pushed through the belt, but the long sword, like Horiko is joking, is like it's probably held there by a magnet or something, because there's no other way that I can see that it's being held there in place. But yeah, so we'll end the digression for that. And let's talk about the final reason why I'm kind of doing this. And the confession is, I don't actually like the Draconis Combine much. I am just kind of stringing through this. Like, I know BattleTech. I've been learning a lot about Japanese history, so why not take the opportunity to learn more about a faction I don't actually enjoy all that much? I don't know, maybe I'll find something that will make me eventually actually want to play this faction when I'm not playing a merc or something. So, going from that, let's talk about qualifications. Like, am I actually qualified to do something like this? Well, I mean, the short answer is no, but let me elaborate a little bit. So, I'm not a historian. I'm going to just say right out, I am an embarrassed weeb. I am not trained. I call myself a history enthusiast because I do not have a history degree. I am not trained in historical methodology. You know, I kind of want to change that later, but just to set expectations, like, I'm not a person who can very incisively say, like, this is right, this is wrong, this is like bonkers historiographically, etc., etc. I'm a history enthusiast. You either find something I like about them or dislike them even more. Yeah, basically. But, you know, I don't mind going through the activity. So yeah, I'm not a historian, but I do know some Japanese history. Like, as a VTuber, like, I present topics on various aspects of Japanese history and culture. You know, I primarily look at the Edo period, but, you know, occasionally I have to look at other things. And yeah, sometimes I stream video games like Disgaea, but, you know, I've done a presentation on Edo era clocks. Horiko and I have done a presentation on Castletown mascots, which was a lot of fun. Should do it again sometime. But yeah, like, I've also been doing like a series of presentations on various papers I've read just to kind of keep me honest about that. Yeah, mascots was a lot of fun. So yeah, like, so I think I know some like Japanese history here. And well, what about the other side? Well, I like to think I'm a BattleTech fan. I have been a fan off and on since the 90s. So it's not like I'm going into this just wanting to hate on some old franchise that got their samurai wrong or something. Like, my first BattleTech box set was 3rd edition. To the point where, like, I didn't even bother buying AGOC, you know, Game of Armored Combat, because, like, I didn't need it. I had a box set already, and I just bought some extra minis and stuff. You know, if you want further proof, I'm not going to show it to you because I don't want to dox myself, but I've owned a physical copy of the first Somerset Strikers source book since it was first published. I also have an unseen version of Technical Real 3025 that I've owned since it was printed. So, like, I at least have the tokens that indicate that I've at least paid attention to this franchise for a decent amount of time. Well, okay, so kind of maybe sort of qualified, but, you know, still have limitations. Like, for now, like, I'm only going to be covering some old musty source books. Like, for the most part, I still need to go through a lot of the Combine-focused novels. Like, I've read Wolves on the Border, but I haven't read Heir to the Dragon, haven't read the Caballeros trilogy, etc. So it's mostly, like, the source books that I'm looking at. I also am kind of not really doing, like, the latest source books or Shrapnel because I don't have, like, all of the Shrapnel books, and I know that there's a bunch of Combine-related stuff there. I've seen some of it, and, like, I actually kind of like it to some degree or another. Like, I think they do some decent work on that, but that is currently out of scope because I don't have enough to actually discuss them in a way that I'd like to. Along those lines, the Dark Age and onwards is not in scope either. So basically, a lot of these source books, including the main House Karita source book I've been looking at, is basically 3068 earlier. And this is prior to the Word of Blade conflict and later eras, including the most recent one. So this is just, like, kind of it. So, having said that, like, that's my introduction to Combine studies. So let's talk about the bonus. And the bonus is actually me attempting to demonstrate Combine studies by kind of demonstrating some of these Combine government agency etymologies. What do I mean by that? Like, so there's a bunch of agencies. You know, it's a big star nation. It's got government agencies that handle various government affairs, and they've got some interesting names. So, you know, let's get into some of them. So, general notes, like, Combine agency names have both English and Japanese names. They are not actually translations of each other, and I will show you in a bit why that is. They are not consistently Romanized, so for those who are not completely aware of Japanese, you know, typically if you're rendering like Japanese into like Roman characters, there's different types of romanization. So it's called romaji. And one of the features of Japanese is that you have what's called a long vowel. In this case, it's a vowel that you would hold longer than normal. So if we take an example here, shoji, like shoji panels, that sort of thing. Yeah, my old friend, my old crutch, yeah. And yet we still have to use it when we're doing books like this. So if it were a short vowel, like short held sound, it would be like shoji. But if it's a longer vowel, so in this case with the macron, it's shoji. So many terms which date back to the original House Kurita sourcebook from the 80s use an umlaut to denote a long vowel. And that's not really common, especially in modern books, but it happened because back in the day, it was hard to typeset with a macron because like the character wasn't available, so you just use whatever was available. And in the case of the old house book, they used the umlaut, so 2 dots. What happened was that in the current house source book, which dates from 2015, they carried over those names, like the Japanese Romanized names, but they didn't change the umlauts. So you have government agency names with these umlauts, but still using... Well, umlauts got turned to vowel plus E, so I guess it's shoji, shuji. Oh, shoji. Yeah. Well, this just shows you that romanization is not consistent across languages. But yeah, like, but just to say, like, the current house book, like from 2015, uses the standard macron for things. So, like, for example, this character, this word shoji, is actually from the House Kurita sourcebook. So we have a situation where basically, like, you have these umlauts plus, like, standard macrons. So it sort of indicates to me, at least, that either the author or the editorial team did not realize that this was a typesetting thing and not a, not like an intentional thing on the part of the original authors. But for the sake of consistency, like, for anything that I'm using in Japanese that isn't directly ported from a source book, I'm using macrons. So without further ado, let's talk about some of these agencies. So let's start with the Hyobusho. So the Hyobusho is the Ministry of the Expansion of the Glories of the Draconis Combine. This is also known as the Ministry of War. So, Shuji, yep. So, like, the etymology of this actually comes from a real name. So, the Hyobusho was the name of the Ministry of War of the Imperial Court under the Ritsuryō system. So, the Ritsuryō system is the classic imperial Japanese, like, political system and administrative system. So, like, emperor had his court, he had a minister of the left, a minister of the right, minister of the center. Those folks have their own, like, sub-ministers and ministries handling different sorts of work, like, administration, that sort of thing. So this was the system that kind of existed in the Nara to Heian period, so basically the 8th through 12th centuries before the first Kamakura shogunate was established in the 13th century. 12th century, sorry. So yeah, like, so the name is proper, at least in Japanese. And I will get to the English names in a little bit, but, like, moving on, like, so next one, the Minbusho. So this is the Ministry of Well-Being of the Land and the Peoples, so-called Ministry of the Interior. So that's basically from the book itself, where they talk about the Ministry of the Well-Being of the Land and Peoples, and then parentheses Ministry of the Interior. So the Minbusho was another Ritsudio like ministry and it was the Ministry of Popular Affairs. So basically things that concern the common people. Yeah, they sure do like their flowery terms, don't they? And moving on, we have Okurasho. So the Okurasho is the name of the Ministry of the Treasury and the Ritsudio system. And this is in the Draconis Combine, also known as the Ministry of Wealth and the Dispersing of Assets, also the Ministry of the Treasury. And this is where we start doing some interesting things here. So, this is the Ministry of Peaceful Order and Honor, aka the Ministry of Justice, and is known as kakun. This is not a Ritsudio agency. Kakun are house precepts. They are actually instructions or exhortations that warrior house heads would pass on to their heirs. Basically, it's guidance about how to run the warrior house, or not necessarily the territorial populace, although sometimes that gets put in, but it's not a ministry. It's not like actually, it's like not like some organization. It's actually just a type of written document, but somehow in the original house book and now in the current house book, they decided to call this the Ministry of Justice. Yes, so you've inherited a fief. Yes. So you're a Shugo now. Now what do you do? And speaking of which, why don't we take this time to do a small digression into what exactly a kakun is, like, or at least an example. So the example here is the Gokurakuji letter. So this was written by a Hojo Shigetori. Written by a Hojo, who was the family that basically practically ran the Kamakura shogunate after like the second or third Kamakura shogun. And they basically became the family of regents. So yeah. Just to give you a sense of like what is in these. So to about when does this letter date? So this I need to double check when this was written. So this particular Hojo was relatively early in the period. So this was written between 1256 to 1261. And yes, this is Hojo Shigetoki. He was never Shiken himself, so Shiken was the regent that functionally ran the Kamakura shogunate in the name of the shogun. But he was very influential, and he passed this on to his own children, who would help run the Hojo clan. And so yeah, it's like a bunch of like precepts or just instructions on how to behave like a lord, how to conduct relations between you and your peers, your subordinates, the shogun, other lords. Basically nothing that has to do with the Ministry of Justice. So just to give you some ideas here. So like precept number 4 in this letter: even in minor matters, you must not disobey a parent's instructions. The purpose of such instructions is always to benefit the children, but children who obey them are few indeed. Close your eyes in concentration and think carefully about this matter. Do not besiege a fortified city. My mistake, that's a different book. Yeah. It's slightly different, but like, yeah, very much the same thing. Yeah, literally meditate on this. Yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, like Shigetoki in his last years basically became the head of Gokurakuji, which is a temple. It's a Buddhist temple. So yeah, like, just So precept 4 here is about, family relationships and, obedience and stuff like that. Precept 10 here is just, when you pour sake for guests, kneel when you are 3 paces from them, then advance and pour, then go back, still on your knees, and bow to them. Be careful in small rooms or in the presence of women of rank. So you can see, the information and things that are given are kind of disparate. And just keep on going. Like, never punish a servant while you are angry. When you have calmed down, call to mind his past record. Compare this with his recent behavior, and if on balance he has shown little loyalty and has now done something serious, punish him. But if you punish him while you are still angry, you will regret it afterward. How to treat your subordinates. Number 52. When you see off someone to whom you owe particular respect, such as your lord or your parent, you should, as long as he is in sight, show reverence by bowing in the direction of his departure as deeply as when you stood before him. While doing this, it is very wrong to cease bowing or to discharge arrows. I think I have to ask a little bit about that last bit. Yeah. 52 has survived into modern day. It's very visible in hospitality culture. It's true. I'm very happy that people at the business hotel do not shoot arrows at me as I leave. And finally, one of these things that I guess we could say is related to justice. When you are judging a legal case, listen carefully to the defendant's denial as well as to the plaintiff's accusation. It often happens that a person, confronted by another's passionate plea, cannot present his own case coherently. How sad it is when he is condemned, in spite of his innocence and his firm conviction that the charge would be proved false. When a person faces the authorities, he cannot keep a calm mind. Punishment will follow possible conviction, and this will serve to increase the accused man's fears. If you sit in judgment over simple people, you must bear in mind that this is how things are. Then you will be a wise magistrate. So yeah, you can see that, and there are multiple examples of kakun that are available, that this only very tangentially relates to administering justice in the form of a government agency. And to be honest, I have no idea why the authors of the original book House Kurita book decided to actually do this. Why they picked kakun as the name. Yeah, some genuinely good advice in there. Yeah, I agree. And I think some folks who are more knowers of the Combine may actually look at some of this and think about a different aspect of the Combine. And I'm going to reserve that for another presentation someday. But I think you might find some of what's going on here to be pretty familiar. So last but not least, I've got one more agency here, and that's the Kasoku, or Ministry of the Servants of the Draconis Combine, or the Ministry of the Court. So just the etymology here, the original house book uses kazoku, and the current book uses kasoku. And I couldn't really find anything on kasoku, but kazoku itself refers to the peerage of the Japanese Empire post-Tokugawa shogunate. And they're basically the former imperial nobility and former daimyo smushed together into a noble peerage group. So they all became barons and marquesses and princes and that sort of thing. And they would also eventually become the upper house of the imperial diet up until the end of the war in 1945. But as you can see, the name Kazoku itself is the nobility. It's not a ministry of the court. And in this case, the ministry of the court in the Draconis Combine is the ministry that actually handles court affairs, on Luthien, the capital, that sort of thing. And the name, the Japanese name doesn't actually match what like they're trying to get at. It's kind of sort of related in that both are kind of nobility related, but in the Draconis Combine, like they actually use the term kuge, which is like noble house, as opposed to like the bouquet or warrior house. And yeah, so not sure what's going on here. So yeah, just quickly, like these are kind of the sources that I've been using to kind of figure out a lot of these like agency names, etymology and stuff in there. Like, so, you know, obviously we have the fastest source books, we got the BattleTech wiki, but also like various like Japanese history books to kind of like verify like what I've been seeing off of Wikipedia. Because, you know, like unfortunately, like once you start kind of learning a bit about a particular subject, the information available in Wikipedia starts becoming less and less reliable, at least to your estimation. So I wanted to make sure I had other sources that I could consult. So yeah, like I've got like certain questions about and comments about some of this stuff, and it's like I don't know why this is. Like you mentioned, like you guys mentioned it earlier, but why are the English names so ridiculously grandiose while the Japanese isn't? You know, and so one of the funnier things is that because if we think about what I said before about Japanization, like the Japanization happens pretty late in the creation of the Combine. So it's entirely possible that the English names existed before the Japanese names really did. So one can ask, why are the English names like this and the Japanese names are not actually like a direct translation, or vice versa? My pet theory is that not Japanese, but English names tend to end up like being that kind of like flowery, indirect sort of notion that I think a lot of people tend to associate with Asian cultures for some reason. I will say the grandiose names don't really fit the aesthetic of the Combine, specifically the government anyway. But I mean, that's the thing, right? It's like they are part of the aesthetic of the Combine, but why is the aesthetic that way? You know what I mean? Like if we think about the Combine as we always think of it as space samurai or whatever, but if you actually look at the history of these things, like some of the things that we assume kind of fit that don't actually fit that in real life. So if we're thinking about like, oh, well, the Ministry for the Well-Being of the Peoples and whatever, right? It's tend to think of it as like, oh, that's just a kind of indirect way that Asians or Japanese like name things. And it's actually not really true. Like if you look at the Japanese names, they're actually direct. Like they're actually proper direct names of things. Good point. In universe and out of universe ideas. Oh, I would be interested in hearing those if you got them. But moving on for the time being, like I wonder what happened in the editorial process that caused them to carry forward the umlauts in these agency names. Because like those were not the only things. There's some like various phrases that I decided to not talk about in this because this was just about the agencies. Like, but why carry forward the umlauts? Like it should, if you happen to know a modicum of Japanese and like how like the Japanese language works and how romanization works, I think you would be able to see that like, okay, these guys decided that they were using umlauts for long vowels and that we should change these when we now have like modern desktop publishing applications and we can add a macron to these things. Like, why are we not changing it? Is there this belief that it's like integral to the name itself that they need to like preserve that? And like, did they not realize that? So like that's just a random question I have about that. And like finally, like, why are these agency names misleading or wrong, but others are accurate? So what was it about these particular agencies, like the so-called kakun for Ministry of Justice and kazoku for the Ministry of the Court? Like, why are we picking those over like what are honestly like different? Like, why are we using those? Right? It's like, I'm not sure why. Like, especially when you've got 3 other agencies that have proper names. Yeah, also, why are they from different periods of time? Yeah, I don't... It's interesting to me that that's not the only example where things from different periods of time are used. I mean, and that's not the end of the world, because we are talking about a science fiction setting where, you know, like, these guys who are making this polity are looking backwards, and they don't necessarily have the same information that we do in real life in the 21st century. You know, we're talking about like people who are 440 light years away from Earth. We don't know what kind of like stuff they're basing their history on, or what their agencies are going to be based on. Like, but yeah, like, why are they like different here? There's no real rhyme or reason why one thing is one way and the other is another way, I guess. So yeah, I mean, those are kind of like the questions. Like, I wish I was trying to do some research about why there's this tendency for Anglophone like writing to assume that like Japanese names for things are similar, are like this ridiculously overwrought, grandiose sort of thing, when they're actually not. So yeah, so like those are like the questions I have. I'm wondering if anybody in chat happens to have any questions that they want to ask. You know, it's I think we've got a few things here that we could probably chew on. Oh, okay. So why are they from... Yeah, so why are they from different periods of time? I don't know. I have to wonder myself. So, if there are no other questions, I think we're done. And thank you so very much for attending. Like, I appreciate folks taking the time to watch this little thing. I do wish had a little bit more, but I think I'm going to try to work a little more on different aspects of this. I think it's a pretty broad subject. Thank you very much. Yeah, so thank you very much. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. I gotta think. I already have like a few ideas I want to think about. Like, I won't guarantee it, but like, let me take a look at what I've got here. Since we've got a little bit of time, I can maybe preview some ideas I have. Please don't hold me to them, though. Yeah, and you know, if anybody in chat has any suggestions, I'm happy to entertain those as well. But yeah, just like just a couple of items here. Like, I found a description of Unity Palace, which is like the palace of, you know, the House Kurita on Luthien, and like there's like different like word like descriptions of it and what it is, and like the newer House Kurita source book goes into a bit more detail about it, and the details are I have questions about those details, and like I kind of want to do a little research on that to see like what I'm trying to think about what they were thinking because it's kind of interesting. Yeah, so yeah, there's that. I kind of want to go into a little more detail about the so-called Japanization of the Draconis Combine, like kind of what went into that. You know, is there like any kind of like historical analog to that? And to be honest, there is, but it's that subject matter is a bit fraught. Yeah, some interesting contrast with Unity Palace 2 being a serene garden palace ground, while the rest of Luthien is kind of an industrial hellhole. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a contrast there. I think, like, I can see some what they're kind of getting at there, you know? That there's a, like, after all, like, if you look at, like, a lot of modern Japanese cities, like, I think you can argue that many of them don't really feel as planned as like European or American cities. And like, you know, you've got tons of like skyscrapers or like apartment blocks, that sort of thing, you know, varying from like low level to like, you know, dozens of stories. And then like in Tokyo, for example, you've got the Imperial Palace like right in the middle, taking up a pretty big footprint. So, you know, and to be honest, people really like that like contrast between the serene ground and then the like the overdeveloped hellscape afterwards. Like even like I think the Foundation series had that with like the Imperial City, where it's like Trantor is the capital planet where everything is like skyscrapers except for this one park. Oh, what else? So this is the thing I was kind of implying before. So there's like a written standard of behavior called the dictum honorium. That's a part of the Draconis Combine. So like every like Combine subject is supposed to follow the precepts of the dictum honorium. And it's like a massive like 7 volumes of tomes where they're supposed to like describe like every single like action or behavior that a subject is supposed to do. So, you know, kind of sounds like some of the kakun that we were reading examples from earlier. So I kind of want to go into a little more detail about like the dictum, like kakun, and maybe other sources for why we have this sort of thing in the Combine. Because like the way that the Combine enforces the dictum honorium is very different than like what kakun and similar were supposed to be historically. Or perhaps it's like the collection of Tokugawa court precedents. So like there are actual examples of the dictum honorium in the various source books, and they're a lot more specific than Tokugawa court precedents or like Tokugawa edicts. So yeah, I mean Tokugawa edicts, for those who don't know, like occasionally as part of the law corpus of the Tokugawa regime, like the Roju or like senior counselors would occasionally issue edicts about specific points of law or orders that they wanted to have conducted. And it's like a really big hodgepodge of things. And they didn't really say, they didn't really say with absolute specificity like how everything should happen, but they could be particular about certain things, especially like sumptuary laws where, you know, you're supposed to dress in a particular way, that sort of thing. But these things weren't always kept in a book that people could consult. They were usually like proclaimed or pasted on a board somewhere. Whereas in the Combine, the dictum honorium is like readily accessible to everybody because everyone is expected to memorize it, essentially. But yeah, I think that'll be interesting. Another thing I kind of want to cover is like religion in the Combine, because the issue of religion in the Combine is pretty fraught and interesting at the same time. I keep saying interesting because like I kind of want to say screwed up in some ways. I can actually think of some analogs to how they treat it, but also I kind of need to address some, like, let's say dragons in how it's characterized, because some of it's not just like the Combine, but also potentially like authors and how they treat certain things. So there's that. Obviously, like, gotta talk about Bushido, because like I think a lot of folks these days, like in 2026, like kind of know that Bushido is not really a thing that existed back in like the samurai age. Like Bushido, the term existed here and there, but Bushido, as people tend to conceive of it, did not really exist in that sense until probably the 19th century, at least. Probably post Tokugawa, really. But, you know, the Combine's in the 31st century, 32nd century. So how the Combine uses Bushido can actually be very comparable to modern views and treatments of Bushido. And the whole complex of that, how it was formed, how it's used and thought about these days, as well as how that's applied to the Draconis Combine, is a subject I want to tackle. So yeah, it just kind of goes on. Like the House Karita source book has just like a gold mine of like tidbits in here and things that you can just kind of mine for like extra investigation, you know. But yeah, so I think that is all I have right now for Combine studies. If anybody has any further questions or comments, like, I would be happy to field them right now. Oh, okay. Yeah, good for now. Okay. Sounds good. So I think then on that note, I think I may transition here. I think I'm going to maybe call it a night on the stream, and let me see if I can find someone to raid. No worries. Thank you. Thank you for attending. I enjoyed this quite a bit, and glad that it sounds like you guys have too. Okay, I think I'm just going to call it a night then. Not really seeing anyone I care to raid at the moment, so thank you all. Appreciate you watching, and I hope to see you all next time.